This was the voice of a generation.
You know, if you want to pick a symbol, you know, what Generation X was, that symbol is going to be Kurt Cobain, and that song is going to be Smells Like Teen Spirit.
He was angry, he was confused, he was resentful, but he just clearly had that total star power thing.
His music sparked a pop culture revolution.
Teen Spirit exploded so big and so fast that it just came from all sides. It just seemed to come on like a tidal wave.
But Kurt Cobain was also a renegade from fame, isolated in a world of drug abuse and severe depression.
Courtney found Kurt passed out by the bed on the floor. He was, you know, deathly pale. There was like blood dripping out of one of his nostrils.
And his life would become one of the greatest tragedies in rock history.
As far as the music world was concerned, when Kurt died, the air just went out of the room. It's like a silence.
Nothing to lose.
Leads you to where you are today.
I believe in storytelling.
It's gonna make you a star.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
Biography.
In 1994, Nirvana was one of the biggest rock bands in the world. Their third album, In Utero, had recently debuted at #1, and the band's runaway success was largely thanks to its charismatic frontman, Kurt Cobain.
Kurt was the iconic frontman of a 90s rock band. Brooding, but yet out there, reserved and introverted, yet in your face about what he was saying, and that was the 90s personified.
Just the urgency that Kurt brought to the stage, and you know, the energy and the vocals and his singing and his stage presence was very commanding.
But outside the limelight, all was not well with Cobain. Long-time problems with depression as well as drug addiction were taking a severe toll on the singer-songwriter. And during Nirvana's In Utero tour in the winter of 1994, Kurt's problems and the pressures of fame were proving too much.
By that time, all of the, you know, the performing, the fame, all of it was definitely taking its toll on Kurt. They'd cancel some shows, he was sick, he had bronchitis and laryngitis.
He couldn't take the fact that he was sick all the time. He couldn't take the pressures of being a spokesperson anymore. He couldn't take the pressures of people wanting to know so much about him anymore.
While Nirvana was on a 2-day hiatus in Rome, Cobain's wife, Courtney Love, along with her daughter Frances, paid him a visit. The morning after her arrival, Courtney woke to a horrifying sight.
Courtney woke up to a really comatose, really nearly dead looking Kurt.
She realized he had, you know, taken about, they estimated about 50 Rohypnol and with a bunch of alcohol.
Kurt was rushed to a hospital in Rome, where doctors pumped his stomach to rid his body of alcohol and the powerful sedative Rohypnol.
It was just a runaway train, and really no one knew what to do, and that was totally terrifying.
He couldn't have sent any clearer of a sign to people that he was not happy.
Cobain's crisis in Rome was the beginning of one of rock music's most infamous tragedies, but the seeds were planted long before his music made him a star. Kurt Donald Cobain was born in Washington State on February 20th, 1967, to Donald, an auto mechanic, and his high school sweetheart, Wendy Cobain.
Well, Kurt was born in Aberdeen, which is outside of Seattle. It's fairly rural. It's a logging town. The whole industry of the town is based on that.
His dad didn't make a whole lot of money, and you know, the family was always kind of scrambling to get by financially. But even so, by all accounts, they were a very loving, very close family.
Kurt was this sort of happy, sunny kid and woke up every day with a smile on his face and just loved life. He was a really artistic kid. He wanted to paint, he wanted to draw, he wanted to kind of explore that side of creativity from a very early age.
As a boy, Kurt discovered the pleasures of music as well.
His mom in particular was always playing like the Beatles and the Monkees and other popular music. And you know, he would sing along to the Beatles when he was like 2 years old.
Kurt was first drawn to the drums. His grandfather likes to relate a story about how he would come over to their house
grab all of the pots and pans out of the cupboards, place them on the floor, and pound on those things like crazy.
And then when he was like 4 years old, he started playing piano, and supposedly he had like this amazing ability to sort of just start playing some of the simple melodies that he would hear on the radio.
But at age 8, Kurt's carefree childhood came to an end when his parents divorced.
The reason was money. You know, Kurt was really young, and his mom claimed that the fights were always over money with his dad, and that essentially was what we know about why they broke up.
I mean, they hated each other for a time, and it was brutal for him to see that because he just didn't get it. He didn't understand it. So it was just a nightmare for him. And he was such a sensitive kid, and he became much more quiet, and he wasn't outgoing anymore.
At first, Kurt lived with his mother in Aberdeen, but after 3 months, he missed his father and decided to move in with him in Montesano, 11 miles away.
His mom had started dating again, and he was just very uncomfortable with that situation. So he moved in with his dad, and at first it was a great situation for Kurt because he was sort of the center of his father's attention, and he loved that.
So his dad promised not to remarry, or Kurt forced him to say that.
Unfortunately, what he didn't realize was how seriously Kurt actually meant that. And when his dad did remarry, Kurt just totally held it against him. And it really affected their relationship afterwards.
Worse yet, his new stepmother already had 2 children. At 11 years old, Kurt was no longer the focus of his father's life.
He didn't get as much attention, and that really had a big impact on Kurt.
By all accounts, he terrorized these poor other kids who got brought into this family, and it just didn't work.
Kurt started like not doing very well in school. He started, smoking weed and just like skipping classes. As an attempt to sort of counter that, his dad insisted that he join like the wrestling team, and at one of the wrestling matches, Kurt let himself be pinned by an opponent that he, might have otherwise been able to beat, and his dad was outraged. And it was just Kurt's way of lashing out at his father.
As Kurt entered his rebellious teens, he lived with a string of family members. But no one seemed to be able to get through to the troubled young Cobain. But then, a birthday present changed his life.
For Kurt's 14th birthday, his uncle offered him the opportunity to choose his own present. He'd either have a bicycle or he could have a guitar, and Kurt chose the guitar.
The guitar immediately provided him with an outlet for these feelings that he wasn't able to express otherwise.
That became his outlet, that became his whole identity, and that guitar was, Kurt's lifeline.
In 1981, Kurt entered high school. There, the longtime Beatles fan made the friend who would introduce him to a new style of music, one that suited his rebellious streak and would come to shape his life and his art.
When Kurt was in 9th grade, he met this kid who called himself Buzz Osborne. And unlike Kurt, he had his own band, the Melvins, and he just knew a whole lot about punk rock.
When he met Buzz Osborne, King Buzzo, from the Melvins, Buzz just sort of became his mentor and sort of taught him about punk rock, and he kind of became the Melvins mascot.
He was getting plugged into the sound of visceral 80s punk rock in, early high school, which is pretty much exactly when you want to start listening to that stuff. It's right when you're really vulnerable to it, so you can get in there in your DNA and change you for life, which is exactly what happened to him.
At age 17, punk was becoming an all-consuming passion for Kurt, and it left little room for school.
The music was more important to him, and just before graduation, he sort of figured out that he wasn't going to be able to graduate anyway. He hadn't gotten enough credits, and just said, I don't need to finish this up here. I'm done with this.
It was like, I will just play guitar and listen to music. And so after that happened, he dropped out, and his mother was furious.
His mom said basically he had to get a job or else he was out. And he didn't get one. And one day he came home and all of his stuff was on the lawn. And that was pretty much the end of life at home for Kurt Cobain.
Well, after his mother tossed him out of the house, he just kind of drifted for a while. He would crash with friends, or he would sleep outside. He was just sort of a, homeless and wayward teenage kid. you're cut loose and you're on your own. That's a painful and obviously very, very difficult thing to have to live through.
But thanks to a generous friend with a spare couch, what seemed like a dead end for Kurt would open up a whole new world.
E8.
Kurt Cobain was the lonely and depressed product of a broken home in Aberdeen, Washington. By the time he was 18, he dropped out of high school and run away from home. But when a generous friend offered Kurt his couch, he didn't just give the runaway a place to sleep. Chris Novoselic gave Cobain's stagnant life a new direction.
Chris Novoselic also attended Aberdeen High School. He met Kurt through Buzz Osborne at one of the Melvin's practices.
They both were interested in punk rock, and Chris was like a bass player. And so, you know, they pretty quickly started talking about forming a band together.
Chris wanted to start a band. Kurt wanted to start a band, and the timing was right. It just fit.
In 1987, they started playing together, Kurt on guitar and vocals and Chris on bass. They eventually dubbed themselves Nirvana, and from the start, Kurt provided the artistic vision.
From the beginning, he was the leader. Writing the music, he was the creative visionary, and he was also the guy, you know, making sure rehearsal happened every day and like keeping everyone on schedule.
Kurt was so demanding as far as how good Nirvana would sound that they constantly went through like a revolving door of drummers.
Obviously, he was drifting and kind of aimless within the rest of his life, but when it came to his music, he had a very clear vision and sense of what he wanted to be doing. And he's the front man. These are his songs. This is his vision, his identity.
Cobain's affection for music wasn't the only love in his life.
Tracy Mirander was Kurt's first real girlfriend. They met at a punk rock show in Olympia. They liked the same kind of music and hung out with the same crowd of people. And real shortly afterward, Kurt moved into Tracy's apartment in Olympia.
Tracy is the girl that stuck by Kurt, that was there when he needed someone to be there for him. She paid his bills, she kept him fed, she kept him clothed.
I tried to be real supportive of him and help him out because his music was real important to him, and I really, I liked Nirvana a lot, and I wanted them to be successful.
Tracy wasn't the only one with faith in the band. Throughout 1987, Kurt and Chris rehearsed relentlessly and slogged their way through some very low-profile gigs at a local college. But if they were to break through to the next level, they needed to make a demo recording. But demos cost money, something Nirvana had precious little of.
Kurt knew that he needed to get a demo, but he needed to pay for that. And so he took a job as a janitor. He wasn't going to compromise his vision of what his music sounded like. He could compromise the rest of his time to go get a paycheck so that he could keep the music together.
When Nirvana recorded their first demo, they did it at Reciprocal Studios with Jack and Dino, who was a semi-noted producer in the Seattle scene.
So when it came time to scrape together money for the studio, all that the band and Kurt could get together was $152.77. And that bought them basically at $20 an hour. That got them about 6 hours in the studio. They were able to get 9.5 songs done.
When they came in there, even though the songs weren't that formed in a lot of ways, they played them really hard.
I thought they were really good. It just seemed like a very strong, if young band. And something about Kurt's voice really appealed to me. I thought he had a very good rock scream.
But Kurt had no idea how much attention his $152.77 would buy.
Jack and Dino could see something in them, and he passed the tape to the Sub Pop guys, Jonathan Poneman primarily, and said, this is a band you ought to pay attention to.
At that point, Sub Pop was just a small indie label, and you had this incredibly ambitious but totally yet to have accomplished anything rock band looking for a home.
Sub Pop liked what they heard, but Nirvana was an unproven act. Outside a few house parties and small club gigs, the band had never played a big city show. Before Poneman would give them a recording contract, Kurt, Chris, and their drummer of the moment would have to prove themselves in front of the sometimes brutal Seattle rock audience.
On April 24th, 1988, Nirvana played its first Seattle show at a small club called The Vogue. It was a showcase for Sub Pop Records to see if they wanted to sign the band or not. Jonathan Poneman wasn't sure, so he wanted to see them play live.
Kurt was like incredibly nervous. Supposedly he was like throwing up like nonstop before the show.
The pressure was on, and at first, it looked like Nirvana had failed this crucial first test. They drew just 20 fans to the Vogue Club that night, and the band's set did little to impress the audience.
The band was really nervous, kind of tight, and it definitely wasn't their best gig. And supposedly afterwards, Kurt was actually very depressed about it. He was just like, we sucked, we totally blew our chance.
But at least one audience member was impressed with what he heard.
So Jonathan eventually offered Nirvana a deal with Sub Pop and was like, we want your first release to be a single. And not only is it going to be a single, it's going to be a single of your best live song, which at the time was a cover. It was the song Love Buzz.
Kurt was really excited to have a recording of his. He drove it around to radio stations in Seattle and dropped it off and hoped that they would play it.
And I remember we had pulled over at a gas station in Seattle and on the way home from Seattle, and he stopped to call the radio station to request the song.
Kurt got back in the car and drove. And then sometime later they played it.
And then he was just tickled pink, and he had the biggest smile on his face the whole time it was on.
Kurt wasn't the only one requesting Love Buzz. Nirvana's debut single became a local favorite. Sub Pop capitalized on its success with the band's first full-length album, Bleach, in 1989. And it was good timing. Seattle was becoming a hotbed for a popular new sound called grunge.
By the time Bleach came out, there was a Seattle sound. And that sound was heavy music with people swinging their hair around. And it was sort of garage rock and punk. It was sort of metal. And Nirvana were looked at as kind of these young little brothers. And they had some great songs.
Bleach sold about 30,000 copies, which for an indie record, even at that time, was a substantial accomplishment.
After just 2 years together, Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic and their rotating cast of drummers had achieved modest success in Seattle. It was time to take Nirvana on the road, where Kurt would discover that national exposure comes with big risks.
I told Michael Gross he needed a tan. I looked at Fox and I thought,
our own mixed up blend of one-of-a-kind spices. We are Miracle Whip, and we will not tone it down.
At just 18, Kurt Cobain left a broken home in Aberdeen, Washington, and immersed himself in the local punk scene. What he found there was an outlet for his rage and anxieties. In 1989, just 2 years after Kurt formed the band, Nirvana released its first album, Bleach, and garnered modest success on college radio. That summer, to support their release, the band hit the road for the first time with 6 straight months of shows. The European leg of the tour would prove to be especially grueling for 22-year-old Kurt. 36 shows in just 42 days.
So in '89, after Bleach had come out, Nirvana went on their first European tour with another Sub Pop band called Tad. Kurt was really excited about this. This was a big deal. But when they got to Europe, they quickly discovered it was going to be a lot harder and a lot less glamorous than they might have hoped.
There was no money. I mean, Sub Pop really didn't have money. They didn't know what they were doing. It wasn't like you're going to get tour support. I mean, they were kind of on their own.
They would be splitting like a single 10-person van with Tad, so 2 bands would have to fit in there. It certainly didn't help matters that Tad was fronted by like a 300-pound former butcher named Tad Doyle. It was really intense. They were driving all through the night, all through the tour.
And even on this first tour, there were signs that Kurt was not cut out for the life of a traveling musician.
During that time, Kurt is never really kind of the healthiest guy to begin with. He had some really bad stomach problems.
Kurt's stomach problems started flaring up. And whenever they would get a hotel room or be crashing someone's place, he'd be found sitting in a room by himself in the dark, staring at the ceiling.
He was not like the hardy, get in the van, let's go tour punk guy. He really did get exhausted and worn out.
The tour might have been draining, but it was paying off. Nirvana shows were selling out, but as their star rose, Kurt was nearing collapse. When the band reached Rome for their 32nd show of the tour, Cobain had reached his breaking point.
Near the end of the tour at a show in Rome, by all accounts, he basically had a nervous breakdown on stage.
They got a couple songs into the set and it just sounded like crap. And Kurt, the perfectionist, always, could not handle this. He freaked out and he started banging his guitar against the stage and, you know, just screaming.
And from that point, the situation rapidly deteriorated.
In the middle of the show, climbs like a 30-foot stack of speakers and stops everything and says he's gonna jump and kill himself right there.
And the rest of his band sort of stopped playing or trying to talk him down, and he wouldn't come down. And it wasn't helping things that the crowd, this crowd of Italian fans, was starting to scream, jump, jump, jump.
Eventually they got him down from that. But if you look at it, it's definitely not a good sign.
Even at that incredibly early point in Nirvana's rise to fame, the cracks were already showing. I mean, he just couldn't handle it.
Kurt survived Nirvana's final 5 shows in Europe. He returned to Olympia and his longtime girlfriend, Tracy. But the relationship he had so sorely missed on the road proved no comfort to him at home. After 3 years together, Kurt and Tracy broke up. But it wasn't long before Kurt found a new love. Toby Vale was the drummer for the seminal Riot Grrrl punk band Bikini Kill, and Kurt fell hard for her.
Kurt met Toby Vale, who was just a quintessential, independent, strong-willed, mind of her own Riot Grrrl.
Toby Vale was an artistic peer who challenged him, and that completely unsettled him and excited him.
Kurt was completely obsessed with her, and they really weren't together very long.
After a few months together, Toby and Kurt broke up. The already fragile Cobain fell into a severe depression. But from those depths, he would produce something truly profound.
There's nothing like heartbreak to inspire great art, and this is a perfect example of that. He was really devastated by their breakup, and as usual, when faced with sort of all this emotional turmoil, he put it into the music.
It was in the breakup that, he was emotionally charged enough to be writing a lot of the material that turned into Nevermind.
And one of the songs Cobain wrote during this time was Smells Like Teen Spirit.
One night when Kurt was still dating Toby, he was hanging out with her, and one of her bandmates in Bikini Kill, Kathleen Hanna, was also there. And at some point, Kathleen spray painted on Kurt's bedroom wall that Kurt smells like Teen Spirit.
Teen Spirit was a woman's deodorant at the time, and those words stuck with Kurt, and he loved it, and he started writing it on walls and writing it on notebooks and spray painting it here and there.
So he wrote this song called Smells Like Teen Spirit, which was about Toby. It's like she's overboard and self-assured.
But Kurt wasn't just coping with heartbreak through music. In November 1990, he found another way to kill the pain.
During that period, he was very, devastated, and his outlet for that was not only in, this creative outburst that would lead to Nevermind, but also by, trying heroin.
Heroin was a pervasive drug in Seattle around the rock circles at that time. And, Kurt is somebody who had started smoking grass when he was a young teenager. And he starts using heroin.
Battling heavy drug use and severe depression, Kurt struggled to keep his musical career on track. He'd set his sights on a major label deal for Nirvana, and by early 1991, they landed one with Geffen Records subsidiary DGC. And after going through a string of drummers, they had last found one who gave Nirvana the chest-pounding backbeat that would become part of their signature sound, Dave Grohl.
Dave Grohl was the missing piece, and somebody who could play as forcefully and as melodically as what Kurt was playing and singing and writing. That was the piece that really locked this band from promising to fully realized.
With a powerful new lineup, Kurt Cobain, Chris Novoselic, and Dave Grohl recorded their first major label record during May and June of 1991. But as Nirvana labored away in the studio, they had no idea how Nevermind would reverberate around the world, or how it would affect the life of their frontman.
Nicky Scarfo was probably Happy starts here.
By 1989, Kurt Cobain's band Nirvana had built a following around Seattle with their angst-ridden but catchy songs, and the buzz built quickly. In 1990, Nirvana signed with the major label DGC, and the buzz was about to turn into a groundswell when the lead single from their second album, Nevermind, Smells Like Teen Spirit, arrived on September 10th, 1991.
When Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, there was a certain kind of quality about what that generation was going through that Kurt put his finger right on.
Teen Spirit exploded so big and so fast that it just came from all sides. It was on the radio everywhere, and it just seemed to come on like a tidal wave.
The impact of the song was further reinforced by its riotous music video.
Kurt had a very clear idea of what he wanted. He had this idea, he had written a treatment for it, he knew in his mind what he wanted.
The Smells Like Teen Spirit video took this idea of kind of high school pep rally and, you know, kind of set in hell.
And there's cheerleaders, but they have anarchy symbols on their chests, and the crowd is jumping off the bleachers and forming a mosh pit, and you've got a pep rally gone crazy. And so, you know, Kurt, this guy you're meeting for the first time, strikes you as this super angry dude who's like wrecking his guitar.
In the original edit of the video, there's not that sort of iconic shot of Kurt Cobain as the song ends. And Kurt actually, when he saw the video, he went into the editing room himself and added that shot in. It's sort of the shot that sort of made him so immediately recognizable.
Kurt insisted that it be put in. Kurt wanted to look at his audience.
Cobain's instincts were right. Smells Like Teen Spirit became an MTV hit. Nevermind actually kicked Michael Jackson out of the #1 spot on the album chart. A remarkable achievement for a band who'd sold a mere 35,000 copies of their previous release. And that face, it wasn't just another rock pinup. It became an emblem for a generation of fans.
You know, if you want to pick a symbol, you know, of what Generation X was, that symbol is going to be Kurt Cobain, and that song is going to be Smells Like Teen Spirit.
When they saw Kurt on screen on MTV in the Smells Like Teen Spirit video, they saw somebody who was like them. He was angry, he was confused, he was resentful, but he was also totally beautiful. I mean, he was like pinup worthy hot. He just clearly had that total star power thing.
Pretty much right after that, kid just started like dressing like Kurt, like really idolizing Kurt. You know, Kurt just was this magnetic figure who had like this great look and just, you know, emanated this charisma and this passion that really touched a lot of kids.
While fans fell for Cobain, Kurt found his own object of adoration, the 25-year-old lead singer of the punk group Hole, Courtney Love.
The first time I saw them together was at a show that Nirvana did at a small club called the Metro in Chicago. The first tour after Nevermind came out, and Courtney Love and Laurie Barbero were in the dressing room, and I noticed over the course of the next 20 minutes as she wended her way towards Kurt, and I turned around and she was sitting on his lap, and they were together as far as I know from that night on.
They bonded about their childhoods and about music. Courtney Love had a similarly shuffled around kind of childhood and spent like her, you know, young adulthood going from here to there.
But many of the traits that made Kurt and Courtney click also made them mutually destructive.
Once Kurt and Courtney become involved, and one of the things that certainly seems to escalate was the drug use. It seemed like they were each pushing each other deeper into this place.
They were two people that had drug problems, two artists, two people with terrible childhoods and psychological issues, and it was a tempestuous up and down relationship, but he was crazy about her.
The couple were engaged in December of 1991, and the media closed in.
It just very quickly became apparent that he didn't really have a private, personal life anymore, that everything was public domain.
They were like the king and queen of alternative rock, of alternative culture. And it wasn't just music that was sort of being overtaken. It was fashion, it was film, it was TV shows. It was just everywhere. It was absolutely permeating the entire pop culture.
But the man at the center of this pop culture revolution was ambivalent about his own fame. And on January 11th, 1992, the cracks began to show.
In January of 1992, Nirvana were going to perform on Saturday Night Live.
Kurt really loved the show as a kid and was so excited to play and nervous to play that he got really, really messed up.
Before the show taping, he had a photo shoot that he was supposed to do, and he was like nodding off during the photo shoot, and you know, it was very obvious that he was not himself. And then before the show, you know, he was really sick and looked like he was going to throw up. When it came time to actually perform on stage, he pulled through.
Backstage, after the show, he just was clearly stoned out of his mind, and eyes drooping and head nodding down.
After the performance, he skipped out on the cast party, and he actually OD'd on heroin that night / that morning. And Courtney found him, passed out in their hotel room, and she actually revived him herself.
Suddenly, there was just this shift around that SNL period when it started to be clear that not just to the people around him, but to the people who were following this story, that it was no longer kind of a recreational thing for him, like something was really wrong.
And for the troubled rock star, the worst was yet to come.
This wasn't just kidnapping.
She wanted. So hurry into your Toyota dealer today.
Kurt Cobain had been a runaway, an addict, and a high school dropout. By age 24, though, he suddenly found himself an icon for a generation. But Kurt was conflicted about his own fame, and his love life was just as complicated. 25-year-old Courtney Love was a lot like Kurt, a budding rock star who'd suffered a difficult childhood and addiction to drugs. But in January 1992, the couple received happy news. Courtney was pregnant. During a Nirvana tour stop in Hawaii that February, Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love became husband and wife.
They got married on the beach in 1992 in Hawaii, and she was going to have a baby, and Kurt was ecstatic about that.
When Courtney first got pregnant, the couple had to get off drugs. It was clear that she was really motivated to do that because she was carrying this child.
Courtney realized that she had to try and detox. She wanted Kurt to do the same thing. She went and started working on that. He just couldn't make it stick.
But a few weeks before Courtney's due date, Kurt gave detox another chance. In August of 1992, Kurt checked into a 60-day detox program at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, the very same hospital where Courtney was scheduled to give birth.
The way that Courtney tells this story, she was having the baby. She goes and grabs him out of the chemical dependency ward and drags him into the labor room where she's having the baby.
Their healthy baby girl, Frances Bean Cobain, was born on August 18, 1992. Kurt was ecstatic, but the bliss was short-lived.
In September 1992, Vanity Fair put out an article by Lynn Hirschberg that basically just portrayed Kurt and Courtney as complete drug addicts and unfit parents.
Courtney was in the hospital recovering from giving birth. Kurt is still in detox at the same time. The Vanity Fair story comes out, and it's devastating. A close friend alleged that Courtney was taking drugs while she was pregnant.
The Social Services Division of the City of Los Angeles made an investigation into whether or not she was a fit mother.
It resulted in the baby being taken away from them.
This sends Kurt into a relapse. He gets a hold of drugs, overdoses. He's revived, but he's really not the same again.
After 7 agonizing months fighting Los Angeles County, the Cobains at last retained full custody of Frances Bean. But much of the damage had already been done.
You like fatherhood? Vodka? Yes, I love vodka.
In the wake of the Vanity Fair article, the tabloid The Globe alleged that their baby was born with drug-related health problems.
I mean, who would not be very upset with that kind of grotesque media?
It was important to them to try to establish themselves as a viable family, and they did this cover story with Spin magazine. There were these photos of them together with the baby, you know, looking like the happy American family.
It was no mere publicity stunt. The smiling Kurt Cobain fans found in the pages of Spin magazine was indeed happy, in a way he'd never felt before.
People who know him very well have said that it was being around his daughter was the only time that he was really happy.
He was a doting father. He adored being with Frances and adored playing with her, and you know, was like a typical first-time dad. You know, just couldn't take his eyes off her.
Creatively, Kurt was blossoming as well. In September 1993, Nirvana released their third album, In Utero.
The Toby influence was all over Nevermind, and In Utero was the Courtney record.
The first single, Heart-Shaped Box, is actually a reference to an actual heart-shaped box that Courtney sent to Kurt even before they were actually going out. And obviously, it stayed with Kurt and it made an impact.
And it ended up selling millions of records and being a very important, successful record.
A few months after the release of In Utero, Nirvana was approached by MTV to record an acoustic performance for the program Unplugged.
When MTV approached Nirvana about playing their Unplugged show, Kurt Cobain was validated by this. Unplugged had really been like a songwriter's forum at that point. But this also, the stripped-down format also made him extremely nervous. And there was just, he felt a lot of pressure about it. He took it very seriously. And the performance itself, I mean, it really may be Nirvana's greatest performance ever.
There was a great beauty to it. There was a great kind of delicacy that you often can miss in Nirvana's music was really there. It was powerful stuff.
So the very last song that Nirvana played for the Unplugged performance was Lead Belly's Where Did You Sleep Last Night?
At the end of that song, Kurt drew a breath in, looked down, looked back up at the crowd, and screamed the last two words of the song as loud as he possibly could.
You know, Kurt's like howling his guts out by the end. And the story goes that the producer, after they performed that song, actually was trying to get Nirvana out to play an encore. And the other band members were into it, but when he approached Kurt, Kurt was just like, there's no way I can top that song.
He was extremely proud of it and told me, he said, people are really going to see our band differently after Unplugged.
For the first time in his life, Kurt Cobain acknowledged that he delivered a great performance. But even with domestic bliss and artistic triumph, Kurt could not escape his own downward spiral.
That's when I knew that I'd been shot.
By the time Kurt Cobain was 26 years old, he'd suffered a long history of depression and drug abuse. And stardom, it seemed, only made matters worse. In the early 90s, his band Nirvana was one of the best-selling in rock. Their third album, In Utero, sold 5 million copies. But as Nirvana sold more records, their leader was in a free fall.
When In Utero came out, it seemed like the downward spiral for Kurt really began to accelerate.
He'd been a chronic drug abuser for years and years and years, even before I knew him. And once he had access to money and more drugs, he was just constantly going back to that place.
This is sort of the point in his story where heroin becomes basically the focus and the thing that took over everything.
On October 18th, 1993, Kurt, Dave, and Chris hit the road to promote In Utero. Uneasy in the glaring lights of a massive tour, Cobain retreated further into heroin use.
He started to need help sort of just getting through a show. They filled out the sound with other musicians. It just became apparent, even watching them on stage during that period, he just really seemed altered. I mean, he was on heroin a lot. I think the heroin was like a cocoon from all that stuff and all the fame.
After touring Europe for 4 weeks, Kurt Cobain checked into the Excelsior Hotel in Rome on March 2nd, 1994 for a much-needed break. But for Kurt, the hiatus came too late.
Courtney found Kurt passed out by the bed on the floor. He was, deathly pale. There was like blood dripping out of one of his nostrils.
Kurt took a bunch of pills that caused him to go into a coma and almost died.
He had like the packaging from these pills that he had taken this time. He had taken like 50 or 60 Rohypnol pills. And he had like a 3-page suicide note, so it was pretty clear right away that this was a very different situation. And Courtney called an ambulance, and Kurt was actually in a coma for 20 hours.
All of these news reports kept coming back, and what happened, and was he dead?
Many fans were already in mourning that Kurt had already killed himself, although at that point it had been announced as an accidental overdose.
But the incident in Rome wasn't just another chapter in Kurt's drug exploits. Nirvana canceled the remainder of the tour, and Cobain returned home to Seattle with his family. And his brush with death did nothing to contain his appetite for heroin.
Courtney banned him from using drugs in the house, but he found other ways to get to it. And unfortunately, he just kept using when they got back home.
He would struggle. He had many different doctors that he went to and therapists and strategies to fight it, but it was a losing battle a lot of the time.
That spring, it became clear to Cobain's friends that something had to be done.
By March 1994, this is a guy who needed help. Everyone knew it. So his immediate circle had an intervention.
My wife called me saying Courtney really wanted me to be part of an intervention. She was really worried that he was the worst he'd ever been. And then Courtney called, and I said yes. We went to the house in Seattle, and a few other people were there to try to get him to go into rehab.
But the desperate attempt to save Kurt from uncontrolled drug use fell on deaf ears.
It was very painful. He was argumentative and kind of angry about the whole thing.
He basically went downstairs in their house and played guitar with Pat Smear and just didn't want to hear it from anyone, and just told them they were wrong and said he wasn't going to do it.
Courtney had to go to LA, but she kept calling back home constantly, and she was trying to push Kurt into rehab. After a bunch of pushing, he agreed to go to rehab, but he only stayed 2 days and said, I'm going to jump the wall and get out of here, and that's exactly what he did.
For days after, friends searched everywhere, but Kurt had vanished.
Basically what he did was he escaped from rehab, made his way back to Seattle, and, crashed in various places with various people, and did a lot of drugs, sort of went into a severe downward spiral.
When he finally resurfaced, it was too late. On April 8, 1994, Kurt Cobain was found dead in his Lake Washington home from a self-inflicted shotgun wound. His wallet and a suicide note were found near his body. Toxicology reports concluded that Cobain had ingested a lethal dose of heroin before pulling the trigger.
As far as the music world was concerned, when Kurt died, the air just went out of the room. It's like a silence.
I was shocked and surprised. I knew he was self-destructive. He talked about it, and he had song titles about it. I think the original title of In Utero was I Hate Myself and I Want to Die. But the actual reality of it was incredibly shocking.
On April 10th, there was a vigil held to mourn Kurt, and all these fans assembled in the Seattle park, and taped messages from Chris Novoselic and from Courtney Love were played.
Courtney's message was really gripping to hear, and the elements in his suicide note, it was just about as raw as you can get.
I had it good, very good, and I'm grateful. But since the age of 7, I've become hateful towards all humans in general, only because it seems so easy for people to get along and have empathy. Only because I love and feel for people too much, I guess. Thank you all from the pit of my burning, nauseous stomach for your letters and concern during the last years. So remember, and don't remember this because this is a lie, it's better to burn out than to fade away. God, you ass.
When Courtney opened her grief up to the kids and grown-ups who were grieving as well, it was a testament to and a recognition of what he meant to people and what he meant to her and who he was, whether he wanted to be that guy or not.
More than a decade has passed since Kurt Cobain's suicide, but the reluctant icon of Generation X and the troubled voice of the 1990s endures.
As long as we're having conversations about American cultural history, Kurt Cobain is going to be one of the chapters. He is the face of 90s culture. That's Kurt Cobain. He's the icon of his time.
He left behind amazing music. He transformed forever the idea of what rock and roll could be. He's considered rightfully one of the great artists that the genre produced.
I think that the idea of all that was lost with Kurt Cobain is something that kind of fires the imagination of younger people, I think. You know, there was a lot more to do. And I think that in some way, that work has been left to others. You know, maybe that's not a bad legacy to have, you know, where regardless of the suffering that you went through, your life and your music is inspiring other people to create. That's a great gift.